On an early morning flight from London to Geneva, the air in business class was as quiet as a small church in the clouds. The blonde woman placed her Hermes bag on seat 2A, and when the black man approached, she simply said, "You're mistaken. This isn't your seat." There was no arguing, no raised voices, just the calm gaze of Dr. Adrian Cole, a businessman. No one in the cabin recognized the man who, in just 3 minutes, would cause 4 European airports to simultaneously cut ties with the airline. 3 minutes. 3 minutes of silence. Enough time for the world to remember that true justice does not need to be shouted, because sometimes the one who gets looked down on is the one who writes the rules of the game. If you believe that dignity is never negotiable, please share this story, and subscribe to the channel to join me on the journey of silent justice. That morning, the London sky was a silvery silver, low clouds draped over Heathrow Airport, in the business class cabin of Aurelian Air Flight 214, bound for Geneva. Everything was perfect: shiny leather seats, shiny glassware, the smell of espresso mixed with soft music playing over the speakers. They say business class is the most expensive silence in the world, just breathing, tapping on keyboards, and the confidence of people who believe they belong in the clouds. A caramel-colored Hermes bag sat on seat 2A. Its owner, Vanessa Hale, was about 32, the daughter of a prominent Manhattan real estate tycoon. Her blonde hair was curled slightly, and her Cartier watch flashed when she brushed it back. Vanessa leaned back, looked around, and exhaled as if the air here smelled of privilege. As the black man entered the cabin, the whole space seemed to sink a beat. Dr. Adrian Cole, early 40s, charcoal gray suit, dark blue tie, dignified figure. He placed his hand on his carry-on bag, looked at the seat number on his ticket, 2A. He stopped. His seat was taken, and a designer bag was taking it up. Vanessa looked up, her lips slightly curled. "Sorry, you must be mistaken. This is the premier cabin." Her voice was not high, not harsh, but contained something soft and cold as ice. Adrian looked at the ticket, then back at the seat number. "Yes, seat 2A. This is my seat?" Vanessa smiled, a smile as thin as a knife. "I think you should check the back seat tickets. They might have misplaced them." She called the flight attendant, her voice polite as she ordered, "He seems to have the wrong class." The flight attendant, a young woman with brown hair, was a little confused. She looked at Adrian's ticket, then turned to Vanessa. "Ma'am, seat 2A belongs to Mr. Cole." The air suddenly became heavy. A few passengers turned to look. Vanessa raised an eyebrow. "Maybe it's a system error. I don't see his name on the premier list." The word he rang out clearly, cutting across the brief silence. Adrian stood still, not arguing. Only his eyes, calm and bright, looked at her like someone reading an old story, with nothing left to react to. A man sitting in the front row chuckled dryly. The laughter drew a few sympathetic glances. Another passenger raised his phone and silently started recording a video. The flight attendant bowed her head and said softly, "Sir, if you don't mind, could you please wait outside the jet bridge for a few minutes while we process the list again?" Adrian was silent for a few seconds. Then he nodded. "I understand." His voice was deep, warm, and without a trace of bitterness. He picked up his suitcase and walked out of the compartment, not looking back. Each step was slow and deliberate, as if he knew he wasn't leaving his seat, but simply stepping back to let the world reveal itself. The hatch closed, no one noticed the small light blinking on the smartwatch on his wrist. A message was sent, just 4 words, Protocol Orion, Level 2, from the Aeroethics Network Operations Center in Zurich. The system began to trigger an automated ethics review chain for Aurelian Air. 3 minutes later, as everyone in the cabin was still debating right or wrong, data from 4 airports, Geneva, Berlin, Oslo, and Vienna came back. Landing slots were temporarily closed. ESG's $920 million account was frozen. No sirens, no announcements, just silence and a man standing in the hallway, looking down through the glass door at the drifting clouds. In the cabin, Vanessa began to notice something. She saw the flight attendants whispering, saw the captain come out with a nervous look on his face. A passenger whispered, "Do you know who he is? Adrian Cole, CEO of SkyVantage Systems. He wrote the European Aviation Ethics Standards." Vanessa turned, her face pale. She looked back at her Hermes bag, suddenly heavy with evidence. The door opened. Adrian returned, as silent as he had left. No one spoke. The flight attendant bowed and moved the bag to another seat. Adrian sat down in seat 2A, his own. There were no apologies, no applause, just the sound of engines starting up, and the feeling that everyone in the cabin had just learned something, though no one dared to say it. Vanessa looked over. Adrian opened his laptop, eyes glued to the screen. She wanted to say something, but she didn't know where to start. Sometimes silence is the deepest punishment the world can give to those who don't know they're wrong. On the Aeroethics control screen, a status line appeared: incident logged. Bias event class 2, 93% probability. Justice does not need to be spoken. It just needs to be recorded and run its course. And that's when the story takes a new turn where real power begins to speak. When the plane hit the clouds, people still didn't know that the man they had just tried to eliminate was the one who had the power to decide whether this airline would be allowed to take off or not. The cabin was bathed in a soft yellow light, and everything seemed to have returned to normal. Vanessa looked out the window, avoiding the eyes of the man beside her. She couldn't understand why the atmosphere in the cabin had become so heavy. The captain walked past Adrian's seat and bowed slightly. It was a small gesture, but enough to make a few people look up as if they had just witnessed something beyond comprehension. Adrian remained seated, his hands on the table, his eyes fixed on the space between the clouds. He did not look like someone who had just been insulted, but like someone who had seen this happen so many times that nothing surprised him anymore. A stewardess approached softly. "Mr. Cole, would you like some coffee?" "Thank you," he replied, his voice deep, black, no sugar. The flight attendant nodded, her eyes briefly confused as if she had just realized his identity. She left, leaving the cabin silent. Vanessa glanced at him through the mirror. She wondered, why did the captain bow slightly to the man? And why did the staff call him Mr. Cole instead of Sir as usual as the plane steadied? Adrian opened his laptop. On the screen, the Aeroethics Network logo appeared, a blue circle, symbolizing global equity. Beneath it, in small print, dignity as infrastructure. Information window pops up. Adrian Cole, CEO, SkyVantage Systems Chairman, Aeroethics Network. Vanessa skimmed through it, her heart suddenly tightening. She had seen that name in the business magazine last month, the man known as the engineer who rewired the skies. She remembered the article saying, SkyVantage Systems is the company that designs the lightest carbon fiber frame in Europe, helping to reduce fuel consumption for commercial aircraft by 18%. They supply more than 20 airlines, including Aurelian Air. But the part that made Vanessa swallow was the next paragraph: Aeroethics Network, the aviation ethics rating system that Adrian founded. Every airline, every airport, every employee is given an ethics score according to a transparent algorithm. If their credit score falls below a certain threshold, they lose their temporary landing rights. The press once wrote, in the airline industry, a word from Dr. Cole can put an airline out of business in a matter of hours. Vanessa looked at him, feeling a strange feeling, not fear, but shame. She remembered her own voice from earlier. You must be mistaken. This is the premier cabin. The man next to him, it turns out, not only has a valid ticket, but also sets the standard for the world to determine what is valid. Coffee was placed in front of Adrian. He nodded his thanks, opened another small window, and signed the document. The words appeared on the screen. Incident logged. Review in process. His movements were gentle, calm, as if it were just part of his daily routine. But only he knew each number. Each line of data was spreading through the servers of Zurich, Berlin, Geneva. He did nothing in retaliation. He simply let the system do what it was designed to do: protect human dignity. The cabin was silent. Vanessa sat hunched over. A passenger behind her opened an e-newspaper and clicked on the latest news. The headline appeared on the screen: 4 European airports suspend Aurelian Air landing rights, suspected violation of passenger code of conduct. No one said anything. No one dared to ask. The captain appeared and approached Adrian. Mr. Cole, we sincerely apologize for the misunderstanding earlier. Would you like us to contact headquarters to explain the situation? Adrian looked up slightly. No need, sir. Everything's being taken care of. His voice was as light as the wind, but carried such weight that the captain could only nod. A moment later, the chief flight attendant came and handed Adrian a white envelope. This is an official letter of apology from the airline, sir. He chuckled, placing the letter on the table, unopened. Thank you. I think I'll read it when we land. Vanessa looked at the letter. She knew she was the cause, but she didn't have the courage to speak up. In her head, she heard her father's words. The silence of the powerful is the scariest thing. She began to understand why. Adrian closed his eyes and leaned his head back against the seat. A flashback flashed through his mind, his years as a young engineer in Detroit. Kicked off a flight because he didn't look like he belonged in business class. That day, he vowed to create a system where people were judged by their character, not their skin color or background. Now that the system is in place, you don't need to get angry. You just need to let it work for you. Outside the window, white clouds rolled like soft rivers. Below, Europe shrank, airports stopped, contracts awaited, and the world began to wonder what had just happened. Vanessa whispered, almost loud enough for only herself to hear, "Sorry." Adrian opened his eyes and looked at her. "No need," he replied. "You will understand." There was no sarcasm in his voice, just the truth, simple and quiet. The plane continued to fly forward, cutting through the clouds, leaving behind a thin trail of smoke. Their story was not over, but the first lesson had begun. When a man keeps his cool in the face of insult, the world is forced to reflect on itself, and somewhere in the Aeroethics Operations Center, the system just added a note: case ID 4412 confirmed. Bias event, initiate review level 2. Justice is still at work, silent but precise. As for Vanessa, she will carry this moment with her for a long time, as a small trace of a day when the world turned upside down because of just a calm look. The story doesn't end here, because sometimes, to understand the power of silence, we have to see the storm it creates behind. As the plane descended into Swiss airspace, Geneva Airport radar displayed an unusual message: Aurelian Air. Land-in authorization suspended pending review. No one in the cabin knew it, but the man in seat 2A had just changed the entire history of this airline's operations, and that's just the beginning. The Aurelian Air cabin saga goes beyond the return of a seat. Sometimes, the most dangerous thing isn't the action, it's the language. One wrong word can open doors you wouldn't expect. Not long after the captain left, Vanessa Hale spoke again. Her voice was small, but loud enough for the whole row to hear. "I don't want to sit next to him. He makes me feel unsafe." The last two words rang out clearly, cold and sharp as a knife. Unsafe. The word sliced through the air, through skin, into the eyes of those pretending not to hear. A man sitting in row 3 slowly raised his phone and started recording video. Another pursed his lips, half agreeing, half curious. The flight attendant stood there for a few seconds, unsure of what to say. Adrian sat still, unblinking. His hand touched the coffee cup, the heat spreading across his skin. He didn't look at Vanessa, didn't offer any excuses. Didn't ask why. If anything changed in him, it was his breathing slower, more even, calm as data, calm as a stream of data being processed, not hot, not cold, just precise. Vanessa met that gaze. It wasn't anger, nor was it fear, just a silence that made her feel smaller. Flight attendants. She continued, trying to keep her voice even. You should check the passenger list before seating strangers near female passengers. I pay for safety, not trouble. The word stranger rang out, drawing a few nods of agreement, but at that moment, in the back seat, a middle-aged woman, Martha Reynolds, a retired lawyer, looked up. She looked at Vanessa, then at Adrian. She'd seen this scene too many times in her life. Words were as light as air, but contained enough weight to weigh down a person's life. "He didn't do anything," Martha said calmly. "You just feel insecure because he's different." The whole cabin was silent. Vanessa blushed and turned away. The flight attendant bowed slightly to Martha, then turned her gaze to Adrian as if waiting for a reaction. But he remained silent, his eyes fixed on the window. There, the sunlight was reflecting off the plane's wings, cutting through the clouds like a bright slash. Adrian took a sip of coffee, put the cup down, and spoke in a low voice as if talking to himself. Language is always the sharpest weapon. It is wrapped in politeness, but can kill a person faster than any knife. The words were directed at no one, but everyone heard them. A young man sitting nearby nodded slightly, while Vanessa clenched her fists. The plane continued to climb, cutting through the cold air. Inside, the silence was as thick as a blanket. Then there was a small ding. The Wi-Fi signal connected. A passenger opened social media, and a video of Vanessa saying, "He makes me feel unsafe," had just been uploaded. In less than 5 minutes, the views had skyrocketed, but Adrian didn't know, and perhaps didn't care. He was used to letting the world talk while he acted. The numbers were running in his head. The aeroethics system had recorded Vanessa's voice data, the emotional frequency, the stress of her syllables, all of it being analyzed in Zurich. a process that no one in the capsule knew was happening, silent and irreversible. He makes me feel unsafe. One sentence, one data point, and from there, the entire airline industry will have to rethink its definition of safe. Adrian looked back at Vanessa. She tried to avoid his gaze, but her hands were shaking. Perhaps, for the first time in her life, she realized that the power she held wasn't real. It was an illusion sustained by the fear of others. Martha Reynolds, a middle-aged woman, turned to Adrian and whispered, "You don't have to say anything. The world will teach them its lesson." He smiled slightly. "I know. I'm just doing my part." The answer sent a shiver down her spine. It was both gentle and frightening, like the voice of someone who no longer had anything to prove to the world. Vanessa bowed her head, pretending to read the magazine, but her eyes couldn't focus. With each page she turned, her face was reflected back at her, proud, cold, and now melting beneath the reflective glass. No one in the cabin said another word. The silence was no longer uncomfortable, but a kind of gentle judgment. Adrian continued working, his hands moving slowly over the keyboard. On the screen, a map of the European airport network appeared. A small window lit up Review Triggered, Geneva Hub, somewhere. Managers at Aurelian Air headquarters will soon receive a message they were not expecting. Vanessa still had no idea what was coming. She just felt her seat getting colder than before, and she didn't understand why everyone was looking at her differently. Sometimes justice doesn't come with the bang of a gavel or a sentence of condemnation. It comes with a look quiet, but inevitable. Martha closed her eyes and smiled slightly. She knew this flight would be different from the others. For here, one man chose silence over anger, and that silence is making the whole world listen. As the fasten seatbelt sign came on, the captain's voice rang out, a little shaky. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. Our airline will be making some adjustments upon landing in Geneva." No one understood what that meant except Adrian Cole. He leaned his head back in his chair, his eyes closed, his lips moving softly, perhaps a prayer for a world that knew when to be silent. And then, like a gentle breeze, everything became still again. The flight continued, but from that moment on, no one in the cabin was the same anymore. Because just one sentence, "He makes me feel unsafe," and the way a person chooses to stay silent about it is enough to change the entire balance of power. The story is not over, for when silent justice begins to operate, an entire system will have to look at itself in the mirror of truth. The moment played out like a slow-motion movie. As the flight attendant approached, her voice remained professional, but her eyes showed obvious confusion. "Mr. Cole, if you don't mind, could you please step outside onto the jet bridge for a moment? We need to confirm the passenger list." Everyone in the cabin fell silent. Vanessa raised her head, her lips curling slightly, as if her unsafe feelings were proven correct. Adrian nodded slightly. No questions asked. "I will go." Just 3 words, as light as a breath. He stood up, picked up his suitcase, and walked slowly through the narrow aisle, surrounded by scrutinizing gazes. Some were pitying, some were cold, and some were satisfied. As the door closed behind him, the cabin world returned to the hum of air conditioning and yellow lights. But outside, in the narrow corridor leading to the jet bridge, something else was stirring. Adrian stood still for a few seconds, looking through the fogged-up windows. Outside, The plane gleamed in the morning sunlight, a perfect symbol of aviation, where even the smallest ethical lapses could have the biggest repercussions. He took out his phone, opened the security app, and scanned his fingerprint. The screen displayed the Aeroethics Network logo and a series of access codes. He spoke slowly, each word clearly: Protocol Orion, Level 2, Flags Geneva, Berlin, Oslo, Vienna. His voice was even without a trace of emotion, like an engineer flicking a switch, knowing that from that moment on, a huge system would begin to operate. At the Aeroethics Operations Center in Zurich, the indicator light turns orange. Incident detected. Bias event. Triggered appears on the main screen. The engineers on duty in the morning immediately check the data: audio, video, behavior, voice tension. Everything is analyzed by machine learning algorithms. Voice pattern female, mid-30s, elevated tone. Phrase flagged: he makes me feel unsafe. The warning appears with a 93% probability: bias event class 2. The system began sending signals to 4 airports: Geneva, Berlin, Oslo, Vienna. Each airport received an urgent message. Temporary review initiated. Suspend Aurelian air landing priority in just 3 minutes. Administrative decisions worth hundreds of millions of dollars were made. No whistle. No emergency meeting. No one knew. Adrian, however, remained standing there. He did not check his phone or turn to look into the cabin. He simply inhaled deeply, letting the cold air from the air conditioner slowly spread through his lungs. A ground crew member passed by, recognized him, and bowed slightly. "Good morning, Dr. Cole. Is everything okay?" Adrian smiled, "Just a little out of whack, but don't worry. The system will balance itself out." The girl nodded, not asking further. At Aeroethics, everyone understood balance was Dr. Cole's way of talking about justice. He turned back to the cabin door. The flight attendant was waiting, her face filled with concern. "Mr. Cole, we've confirmed. There's been a slight mistake in the list. Please return to your seat." Adrian nodded and stepped inside. The atmosphere in the cabin was different. All eyes were now on him, no longer with contempt, but with confusion, even fear. Vanessa remained seated. She avoided his gaze, but her hands tightened on the edge of the chair. Adrian sat down in seat 2A, as if nothing had happened. He opened his laptop and took a sip of coffee. Outside the window, the sun was starting to rise, its light reflecting off the wings. Somewhere, far away, a series of servers are processing data. Code is scoring ethics scores. Reports are automatically sent to aviation authorities. An email has just arrived at Aurelian Air's Frankfurt headquarters. Compliance alert: possible violation of passenger equity code. Inside the cabin, people didn't know it. They just felt something change the air. The way people looked at each other. The strange silence that fell. Vanessa turned slightly, intending to say something, but her voice caught. Who are you?" Adrian looked at her, his eyes calm, no longer cold, just as gentle as a reminder. Just someone who believes that justice should not depend on who sits in which chair. The answer left her completely silent. A passenger in the back row whispered to a fellow passenger, "That's Adrian Cole, the founder of Aeroethics. If he's on this flight, this airline has big problems." Little by little, words drifted through the cabin like wind through the cracks in the seats. People began to understand that they had just witnessed something more than a scramble for seats, but the true workings of modern justice, where intelligence replaced anger and data replaced prejudice. In the cockpit, the captain received an urgent message from the control center flight under ethical review. Maintain current altitude. Await instructions. He looked at his assistant and sighed softly. Oh my God, they just fired the most powerful person in the aviation industry. Below, in Zurich, the control screen displayed a map, each flight path gradually turning red. The technical assistant asked quietly, "Should we suspend the Orion effect?" The chief shook his head. "No, we're proceeding according to procedure. Dr. Cole always said when the truth is clear enough, the system will speak for itself." And sure enough, just minutes later, 4 airports officially confirmed the suspension of Aurelian Air's priority landing rights. Back on the plane, Adrian looked out the window. The clouds were like thinned paint on the sky. He knew things were starting to move. No need to be angry, no need to fight back. Just be right. A message appeared on his watch screen, Orion Protocol, active, review status live. Adrian closed his eyes slightly. The captain's voice rang out over the intercom in his ear. "Dear passengers, thank you for your patience. We will continue our journey after receiving final confirmation from the operations department." No one understood why the flight was delayed for a few minutes, but up there in the clouds, there was a man who was letting justice speak without any shouting. Sometimes, one person's silence is louder than the noise of the world. And it took just 3 minutes, 3 minutes of Protocol Orion for 4 European airports to stop and wonder what really happened in the business class cabin of Aurelian Air 214 this morning. In less than 3 minutes, the European aviation world began to shake. No sirens, no press releases, just lines of code and internal signals moving between servers cold, precise, and irreversible. At the Aeroethics Operations Center in Zurich, the dispatch screen displayed the first message, "Operational hold initiated." Aurelian Air Level 2. Less than 20 seconds later, the Geneva hub system confirmed the suspension of the airline's priority landing rights. Next came Berlin, then Oslo, and finally Vienna. In just 3 minutes, 4 European airports each, a hub of commerce and finance, simultaneously changed their status to ethical review pending. No one shouted, no alarms blared, just silence, and the system operated like a silent symphony. $920 million in ESG environmental, social, and governance funds linked to Aurelian Air were automatically frozen. Institutional investors from London to Luxembourg received notices, suspended disbursement, suspected violation of passenger ethics standards. In the executive office in Frankfurt, Aurelian Air CEO Frederick Vaughan had just finished a meeting with the PR department when the phone rang frantically. Geneva canceled Flight 214 Berlin just announced the same. What's going on? Frederick was silent for a few seconds. From the window, he looked out at the long, foggy runway. The image of the Aurelian airplane taking off looked smooth, but below the entire empire was shaking. In Zurich, the Aeroethics operations team continued monitoring. A young engineer reported in-flight behavioral data confirms Class 2 event, system impact level high. The team leader nodded. Send an interim report to Dr. Cole. Don't contact him directly. He knows when to respond. And, sure enough, up in the sky, Dr. Adrian Cole remained seated in seat 2A, his eyes fixed out the window, where the morning light was fading over the clouds. He didn't need to look at his phone. He knew the system had already begun its work accurate, silent, like a calculation. Vanessa Hale still had no idea what was happening. She sensed the change in the flight attendant's demeanor, the wary glances, and even the hushed whispers from the passengers around her. She checked her phone. Wi-Fi had just reconnected, and the first notification that appeared Aurelian Air under ethical review by Aero Ethics Network. She read it again, her heart racing. She had heard the name Aero Ethics in financial meetings with her father, who owned a stake in Hale Properties. She looked up at Adrian, who was as still as a stone in the wind. A feeling came over her. He was more than a passenger. He controlled the rules. On the ground, internal news channels began to buzz. Bloomberg flashed the news 4 European airports have suspended Aurelian Air's landing rights while it conducts an ethics review. Insiders say the move was triggered by a minor incident in business class. At the same time, Aurelian Air's stock fell 11% in 15 minutes. Investors urgently contacted the legal department. In Geneva, the airport CEO took a call directly from the Zurich office. We cannot allow an airline to operate when there's a suspicion of passenger standards violations. This is an ethical issue, not just a business issue. It was a chain reaction. One small action, one word, and now the entire airline industry is facing an unprecedented test. Back in cabin 2A, Adrian gently closed his laptop. He heard the captain's voice over the intercom. "Dear passengers, due to technical reasons, we will have to land a little later in Geneva. Thank you for your understanding." His voice was low, but everyone could tell something was wrong. Vanessa bowed her head, silent. She had always viewed people like him with a certain amount of prejudice, a slight, but enough to make one feel out of place. And now, that mildness was shaking her world. Martha Reynolds, the middle-aged woman, leaned slightly toward Adrian. "It seems your system is teaching them a lesson." Adrian smiled. "It's not me. It's justice. It just needs a chance to speak up." Outside the window, the clouds began to disperse, revealing the snow-capped mountains in the distance. A quiet, clean world, like a symbol of truth. Meanwhile, in Frankfurt, CEO Frederick Vaughn stood at the control panel, looking at the glowing red number. "Shut down the PR system. Call Zurich. I want to speak to Dr. Cole." But his assistant just shook his head slightly. "Sir, Aeroethics does not take calls. They only answer when the evaluation process is over." Frederick lowered his hand, silent. Never in his career had he felt his power so meaningless. 3 minutes, just 3 minutes, and a nearly billion-dollar network was frozen. Not because of a technical error, not because of an accident, but because of a word, an action, and the way one person chose silence over anger. Justice doesn't need guns. It doesn't need courts. Just a system programmed by people who know what's right. On Flight 214, when the flight attendant announced that they were about to land, Vanessa still had no words to apologize. But her eyes were different, no longer arrogant, but a fear called awareness. Adrian, however, remained calm. He did not need victory. He only needed the order of justice restored, even if quietly. And in Zurich, the dashboard indicator light just turned from orange to green. A small message appeared: "Orion protocol completed. Review confirmed. System integrity 100%. On Aurelian Air Flight 214. The atmosphere was strange. No one spoke loudly. No one moved. Everyone felt like something had just happened, something bigger than the small incident they had initially thought." A ping sounded from the phone of a passenger in row 3. He, a finance professional from Zurich, had just opened his news app. The screen flashed red text Aeroethics founder discriminated against on Aurelian Air Flight European Ethics System reacts. He looked back, his eyes landing on the black man sitting in seat 2A. Calmly looking out the window, he muttered, "My God, that's him, Dr. Adrian Cole." That one sentence was enough to shake the whole compartment. Murmurs spread from row to row, like a small fire spreading through a dry forest. He's the founder of Aeroethics, the network that shut down 4 airports for Aurelian Air this morning. And we just kicked him off his seat. The chief flight attendant, Elise Carter, received the first information over the intercom. She paused in the middle of the cabin, feeling her heart sink. "Are you sure?" she asked. "Sure. I just checked. It was him, Adrian Cole, Sky Vantage Systems, president of Aeroethics." The voice from the cockpit was Captain Muller. Elise swallowed. She turned to look at row 2A, where the man was still sitting, calm, as if unaware that he was at the center of a huge wave. In the cockpit, Captain Miller put down his phone after receiving an urgent message from Frankfurt headquarters Aurelian Air under review. "Do not engage further. Cooperate if approached by Dr. Cole." He took a deep breath, loosened his tie, and looked at his watch. "We just chased away the man who could have blocked all our landing rights." Elise was silent. She looked at Adrian, then at Vanessa Hale, the woman still sitting stiffly, her eyes wet with worry. The entire cabin seemed to be compressed by the weight of realization. Elise stepped forward and bowed her head gently. "Mr. Cole, on behalf of the airline, I want to apologize for the misunderstanding earlier. The captain invites you into the cockpit if you would like." Adrian raised his head. There was no anger in his eyes, just a cold calmness. "No need. I'll be here." His voice was soft, but every word seemed to echo in the minds of those around him. Elise stood still. In her career, she had met many powerful passengers, but never one who had made her feel such calm, a form of power that did not need to be shown. Vanessa bowed her head. She wanted to say something, but her throat tightened. Her words echoed in her head. "He makes me feel unsafe." Now, she was the one who felt unsafe. Several other passengers started opening their phones, searching for Adrian Cole. A series of posts appeared. The man behind the aviation ethics rating system, Dr. Cole, the engineer who was once rejected from the industry, now sets the standard for the world. Aeroethics, the algorithm that can ground airlines. No one said anything more. Each person realized for themselves what had just happened and what it said about the world they lived in. In the cockpit, Captain Muller turned to look at the flight path display. The light reflected off his tense face. "Should we tell the passengers anything else?" Elise shook her head. "No. Right now. It's best to keep quiet." Adrian looked out. The clouds drifted lazily by, shimmering in the sunlight. He remembered 2008 when he was the only black engineer on the Sky Vantage carbon fiber frame design team. He was also asked to leave the room because people thought he was a technician, not a chief expert. He was silent then, and from that silence, he wrote the system that made the entire airline industry look at itself. Now, history seems to be repeating itself, except this time. He is no longer the one suffering, but the one writing the ending. A small announcement came from Elise's internal headset. "Zurich Control Geneva requests clearance confirmation. Orion Protocol active." Elise turned away slightly, her eyes flashing with anxiety. She understood when the name Orion appeared. It meant things were out of the company's control. Vanessa looked at Adrian and said softly, her voice trembling, "I don't know who you are. I'm sorry." Adrian didn't answer. He just put down his coffee cup, his eyes looking far away. "The sad thing is not that you don't know me," he said slowly, "but that you think you need to know me to behave properly." The cabin was silent. The air was heavy, but no longer hostile but alert. Martha Reynolds, a middle-aged woman, smiled slightly. Sometimes the lesson comes not through a lecture, but through a slow descent. Adrian nodded slightly. He looked away from Vanessa. She understood. Captain Muller opened communication with Headquarters Frankfurt. "This is Flight 214. I have Dr. Adrian Cole on board. I request that this situation be handled according to diplomatic protocol." From the other end of the line, the director's voice was urgent. "Don't touch him. Leave him alone. And Muller, God bless us." Muller turned off the microphone, leaned back in his chair, and let out a soft sigh. He had never felt such a calm storm. Outside, the blue sky stretched endlessly. In the clouds, human moral systems, data, and self-esteem collided not loudly, not explosively, but enough to make the world stop and think. In seat 2A. Adrian closed his eyes and relaxed his shoulders. He wasn't angry. He felt only a slight sadness because humans, no matter how high they flew, had not yet learned to look at each other as equals on the ground. The story continues. Just as the flight was about to land, a call came from Frankfurt to Zurich. Aurelian Air wants to see Dr. Cole, but he just smiled. No need. They will find out for themselves. In Zurich, inside the Aeroethics Network Operations Center, the automated system has just completed the first phase of Protocol Orion. On dozens of large screens, lines of code run continuously, recording data from more than 20 sensors and camera systems on Flight 214. Voice, facial expression, speech rate, even pitch, all analyzed by the network's artificial intelligence. An algorithm designed by Dr. Adrian Cole himself in 2021 is at work, unbiased, uninspired, based on pure data. The central screen displayed a summary, Case ID AUR214UX, bias event detection in progress. Immediately after, a prominent line appeared, result bias event, Class 2, 93% probability. The normally quiet control room was now filled with the occasional tap of a keyboard and the steady hum of a fan. The team leader on duty, Nina Volkov, looked at the screen and nodded slightly. 93% chance of racial bias, she said, her voice emotionless. We're escalating this to the corporate culture review. A young engineer spoke up. So is the fault personal, or the company's culture? The question hung in the air, like a tiny needle piercing the heart of the system. Because in aeroethics philosophy, every wrongdoing is a reflection of a wrong structure. Nina walked to the console and entered the Command Initiate Reflective Audit. Source Aurelian Air, Parameter Employee Behavior, Training Logs, Passenger Complaint Ratio. Blue beams of light began scanning through giant columns of data, internal emails, training reports, employee evaluations, even call recordings between the service center and customers. A secondary screen pops up, showing a waveform graph over the past 12 months. The number of complaints about discrimination by Aurelian Air employees is 38% higher than the industry average. Nina sighed softly. It's not personal fault. A new line appeared on the interface root cause corporate culture deviation. At that point, the system automatically sends a notification to the regional aviation authorities. Aurelian Air requires immediate review of internal compliance and inclusion policies. Probable bias detected in passenger interaction. No signatures or stamps needed. Adrian Cole's algorithm is the moral tribunal of the new age. In an office upstairs, Henry Saavedra, Associate Director of Global Ethics Analysis, was watching the proceedings. He stood silently in front of a hologram screen where a stream of data about Flight 214 was spinning. "Every time something like this happens," he said, "we hold a mirror up not just to them, but to ourselves, because bias never stands still," Nina replied. Dr. Cole once said, "A fair system is one that questions itself." I think it's time we did that. A moment of silence passed. The air in the room seemed to slow down. Everyone knew that. Across the sky, their president was sitting on that plane, observing every reaction, not with the eyes of a victim, but with the eyes of a creator. Inside the central server, a series of sub-processes are activated: ethical climate assessment, bias map, public perception risk index. Each algorithm acts as a different mirror, reflecting the ethical image of an entire organization. The data starts to be rearranged, appearing as a 3D model. 12 incidents involving black passengers in 18 months. 7 flight attendants were warned internally, but no one was fired. 3 internal surveys found that employees felt there was a lack of guidance on handling cross-cultural issues. Nina looked at the model, then said softly, "Culture is never accidental. It is programmed with permission." On another screen, an automated report status line appears: bias confirmed, pending public release in 72 hours. In Frankfurt, in CEO Frederick Vaughn's office, alarm bells were ringing. An email from Zurich had just landed in his inbox: subject preliminary audit result. Ethical deviation detected. Frederick opened the letter and read only a few lines before his heart sank. He understood that when Aeroethics announced deviation, there was no room for negotiation. Call legal, call the media, and send Dr. Cole a formal apology, he said, his voice hoarse. The assistant looked at him, hesitant. He has not spoken yet. Frederick closed his eyes and shook his head. It is because he is silent that we are afraid. Meanwhile, in Zurich, the analysis system finished. The big screen displayed the familiar quote that Dr. Cole had left on the main Aeroethics interface. "No industry is truly clean until it dares to see its own dirt." The room fell silent as it stared at the words. It wasn't a slogan. It was a reminder. Nina sent in her final report: final classification cultural bias, systemic level. Below, the system automatically added a note: recommended action: revoke temporary landing privileges, request corrective action plan within 7 days. All done without a single manual command from a human. And high up in the plane, cutting through the clouds, Dr. Adrian Cole sat silently, the light reflecting off his eyes. The smartwatch on his wrist vibrated slightly, signaling the completion of the assessment. He glanced at it, then smiled slightly. The system has just finished looking at its mirror. Martha Reynolds looked at him and said softly, "Are you satisfied with the result?" Adrian replied slowly. "Justice doesn't need to please anyone, Martha. It just needs to be right." And so, in midair, one man remained silent while thousands of servers on the ground spoke for him. Because justice, in Dr. Cole's world, no longer comes from courts or media, but from data, and from people brave enough to see the truth reflected in their own mirrors. But when that mirror was turned to Frankfurt, where Aurelian Air was headquartered, an entire aviation empire began to tremble. The company's headquarters building, which is usually brightly lit on Monday mornings, was unusually gloomy today. In a conference room on the 42nd floor, Frederick Vaughn, CEO of Aurelian, stood before a bank of screens displaying a series of red-hot charts. 4 major airports just removed our landings from the system in less than an hour, the operations chief reported, his voice tense. Frederick turned, his face pale. What Geneva, Berlin, Oslo, Vienna, all 4. Yaquoser. Reason for note, pending ethical review, aeroethics intervention. No one in the room dared to breathe. 17 people, each of whom had operated hundreds of international flights, now sat silently, looking at each other like misbehaving schoolchildren. Frederick tried to calm himself. We need to understand what's going on. Is this his doing? The paralegal whispered. Sir, they've identified him as Adrian Cole. It was him. The atmosphere in the room fell as if someone had just turned off the power. Frederick stepped back, his hands shaking as he clutched his coffee cup. He remembered international meetings where the name aeroethics was mentioned with almost absolute respect. They weren't just evaluating individual behavior, they were evaluating the culture of the entire organization. Someone from the PR team spoke up, trying to break the heavy atmosphere. We can apologize publicly, send out a quick statement saying the incident was just a misunderstanding. Frederick interrupted. You can't use apology to save a system that's being graded. He walked to the window. Outside, the Aurelian planes were still parked in a row, a symbol of pride, now a testament to the fragility of power when held before the mirror of morality. The finance assistant interrupted, Sir. The ESG funds just announced a temporary withdrawal. About $920 million are being frozen until Aeroethics finishes its investigation. Frederick turned around, and the market AUL stock is down 19% in just 40 minutes, and the media is all over it. The hashtag Orion Effect is trending in Europe. Frederick sat down, rubbing his forehead. We've got the right guy, the one who controls the system. From the other end of the table, a small voice spoke up. It was Clara Jennings, the Human Resources Director. Perhaps it's time we take a look at ourselves. This isn't the first time this has happened. Last year, we had a complaint in Copenhagen. The problem isn't the stewardess. It's the way we train them to feel they have the right to judge passengers. No one answered, because everyone knew she was right. Outside the conference room, the hallway was packed with employees glued to their phones. They read internal messages, looked at financial reports, and quietly whispered the name Adrian Cole. He's the guy who wrote the rules that forced the entire airline industry to redesign its personnel policies last year. One employee whispered, Now, he doesn't have to say anything. The system does the work for him. In Zurich, the Aeroethics Operations Center received a response from the airports. The status line changed from yellow to red: landing rights revoked, temporary hold. A simple message, but enough to put all Aurelian flights on hold on regional permits. Nina Volkov, the team leader on duty, looked at the screen and then turned to Henry Saavedra. The storm has begun, but this time it doesn't need wind. Henry nodded. No need. All it takes is for the truth to spread quickly enough. In London, The morning newspapers reprinted the headline, "Aero Ethics Launches Investigation into Aria and Air After Discrimination Incident on Business Flight." In the comments section, thousands wrote, "It's time for airlines to learn to fly with ethics, not just fuel." Frederick read the news, his eyes lingering on that sentence for a long time. He understood. There was no way around it but to face it. "Prepare a press conference. I will take responsibility," he said, his voice low and tired. The assistant asked, "And what about Dr. Cole?" Frederick was silent for a moment, then replied, "He doesn't need to answer. We've already heard his voice, through this very system." Meanwhile, above, Flight 214 continued its journey to Geneva. Inside the cabin, no one said anything more. Vanessa Hale bowed her head, her hands clasped together. Chief Stewardess Elise Carter walked lightly, avoiding even eye contact with Adrian. Martha Reynolds said softly, "You know what, Adrian?" This storm started with just one sentence from her. He smiled. "Every great storm starts with a little dust. The important thing is the direction of the wind. Below ground, hundreds of investors, ethics boards, and media executives race to deal with the fallout. But Dr. Adrian Cole didn't need to do anything else. His system was working accurate, cold, and uninhibited." "It's strange," said an aeroethics employee in Zurich, looking at a network map. There were no red flags. There was no order from him. And yet the whole of Europe is on pause because of one action. Nina smiled. "That's the power of silent justice." And at the end of the day, as the sun set over Frankfurt, Aurelian Air's official announcement was made. "We are committed to fully cooperating with Aeroethics Network and reviewing all passenger policies. We believe that everyone deserves to be treated with dignity." The press was silent for a few seconds, not because of the apology, but because everyone knew it was no longer an option. It was the consequences. Up in the clouds, Dr. Adrian Cole was still looking out the window, the afternoon light reflecting off his frosted glasses. He was neither happy nor angry. He just whispered to Martha, "Justice is not a storm. It is air. People only notice it when it is absent." In the business class cabin, the atmosphere was different. There were no more whispers, no more wary glances. Everyone knew that what was happening outside, the closed airports, the red stock boards, the emergency meetings in Frankfurt, was all happening in this small cabin. Elise Carter, the chief flight attendant, carefully walked to the front row. In her hand was a passenger manifest and a luggage tag marked Priority 2A. She took a deep breath, then gently bent down to Adrian. "Mr. Cole," she said, her voice low enough for only the nearest row to hear, "I'm so sorry about what happened. We would like you to return to your seat." 2A. Vanessa Hale, the woman who had tried to kick him out, sat up straight, her hands clutching her handbag. She didn't dare look at Adrian, only at her leather gloves neatly placed on the table. Her hands were shaking, as if each finger carried the shame of the entire flight. Elise bent down slightly and touched Vanessa's bag. "If you'll excuse me, these are Mr. Cole's personal belongings." No one said anything, only the sound of a zipper sliding. The whole cabin was dead silent. It felt like the very air was waiting to see what would happen. Elise put her bag back in the overhead compartment, opened the lid of seat 2A, and straightened the pillow and tray table. Then she stepped back, almost whispering, "Your seat, sir." Adrian stood slowly. He said nothing, just walked forward, each step a heartbeat of the cabin. When he sat down, the click of the seatbelt sounded, faint but enough to end a silent war. No threats, no shouts, just order restored by calm. Vanessa kept her head down, her hands clutching the hem of her skirt. She could hear her heart pounding. The image of a few hours earlier replayed in her mind Adrian's eyes when she'd told him he didn't belong there. She understood now that it wasn't seat 2A. It was status, something she'd learned money couldn't buy. Elise backed away to the back of the cabin, her eyes wet. She didn't know why she was so emotional. Maybe it was because in her 12 years as a flight attendant, this was the first time she'd seen someone deal with an injustice without getting angry. He didn't need to scream. A passenger whispered. He just needed to sit down. The words spread out, light but deep, as if the whole compartment was talking to itself. Adrian leaned his head back in his chair and looked out the window. The sunset light filtered through the clouds, reflecting on his cheeks, soft and peaceful. Martha Reynolds, an elderly woman sitting 2 rows away, leaned over and looked at him, then whispered just enough for him to hear. You know, they say silence is the weapon of the weak, but today I think they were wrong. Adrian smiled, not turning around. No, Martha. Silence is only powerful when it is accompanied by understanding. The business class cabin remained silent. A few passengers looked at him, no longer out of curiosity, but with eyes of respect. Vanessa tried to hold back her tears, turned slightly, and said, Mr. Cole, and I'm sorry. I didn't mean, he interrupted her, but his voice was very soft. You don't need to apologize to me. Apologize to yourself, because you once believed that a person's value lies in where they sit. Vanessa was silent. The statement was like a mirror staring back at her. At the back of the compartment, Elise looked back again. Seeing a sight she knew she would never forget, the black man sitting silently in the seat that someone else had once tried to take, not out of pride, but out of truth. A middle-aged passenger, sitting in row 4, turned to his wife and said, It's strange that justice happens without a whistle. His wife nodded. Maybe this time. There's no need to prove right or wrong. Everyone has seen it for themselves. The plane continued toward Geneva. The sky outside stretched like a giant mirror, reflecting the late afternoon sun. Adrian closed his eyes, his lips moving slightly, in a prayer, or perhaps in thanks for the lesson life constantly taught him. True power lies not in power, but in how we choose to respond to injustice. And when the fasten seatbelt sign came on again, everyone understood, not only that the plane was preparing to descend, but also that their egos, pride, and prejudices were being pulled down to touch the ground. 3 hours later, as the plane's wheels touched down in Geneva, the news from the ground was already racing past. The story of a black man denied a business-class seat was no longer an isolated incident. It was iconic. A new hashtag emerged on social media, Jack to Ryan collapse. Within 24 hours, Aurelian Air's stock had plunged 17%. European television stations broadcast special news bulletins, replaying the in-flight cell phone footage. Vanessa Hale pointed at Adrian, her voice high and cold. He makes me feel unsafe, a stark contrast to the scene that followed, as the man quietly sat down in seat 2A amid the silence of the cabin. The news reports opened with big headlines. Aurelian Air has been suspended from landing rights at 4 major European airports by Aeroethics following incidents of discriminatory behavior. The press release from Geneva International Airport is posted on the homepage. In accordance with Article 7.2 of the Air Ethical Convention, we are temporarily suspending Aurelian Air's landing rights for 72 hours due to non-compliance with the standards of fair treatment of passengers. 3 minutes later, Berlin Tegel, Oslo Gardermoen, and Vienna International posted similar announcements. The phrase 72 hours suspension was all over the economic news, but the press didn't use it much. Instead, they chose a more symbolic name, Orion Collapse, a protocol Dr. Adrian Cole had once devised to measure the operational ethics of the airline industry. In Frankfurt, Aurelian headquarters became the eye of the storm. In the emergency conference room, Frederick Vaughan sat among dozens of department directors. His face looked as if it had aged 10 years. "We're losing over $1 billion in market value," a financial advisor said, his voice shaking. Frederick stared at the screen displaying a glowing red chart, each bar falling like falling bricks. "It's not just money," he said. "We've lost trust, something no insurance can cover." Human Resources Director Clara Jennings opened the file and said slowly, "The internal report shows that there have been 27 complaints related to discrimination in the past 18 months, but only 3 have been resolved. Aeroethics has posted that section online." Frederick gripped the arms of his chair. He knew Adrian Cole well. He never talked much, nor did he need to name names. He just let the system do its work. And when the system started working, all pretense would be washed away. A Reuters reporter stood outside Aurelian headquarters, his voice booming on the evening news. This is the first time in the history of European aviation that an airline has been suspended for violating passenger ethics standards. Experts call this the Orion effect, when data and ethics become one powerful monitoring tool. In Zurich, at Aeroethics headquarters, Nina Volkov watched the news in silence. She sighed, then said to Henry Saavedra, "Did you see that?" Henry. No one was arrested. No one was sued. But the system collapsed on its own. Henry smiled faintly. That's the way Adrian wanted it. No need to destroy it, just look in the mirror. The media continued to analyze in the 72 hours of suspension. Aurelian Air had to pay an estimated $48 million in compensation due to canceled flights. ESG Partners withdrew capital from the investment portfolio, and 2 major Swiss banks issued a high moral hazard assessment. But what shocked the world even more, Aeroethics made no official statement, no press conference, no public verdict, just an automated system announcement review and process, no comment. On a London television show, the presenter said, "It's strange, isn't it? The whole of Europe is shaken by an incident without the person who is primarily involved saying a word. That's real power. The power of silence." Meanwhile, Vanessa Hale has become the focus of online attacks. She has been temporarily removed from the board of the Hale Foundation for Women in Leadership charity. A spokesperson for the foundation was forced to speak out. "We cannot allow an action that goes against our mission of gender equality and human rights to damage the reputation of the organization." Vanessa was in her high-rise apartment in London, away from the cameras. Her hands were shaking as she read the news on the screen. One comment was shared tens of thousands of times online. When power is not accompanied by knowledge, it will burn itself out. On the other side, Dr. Adrian Cole did not attend any press conferences. After getting off the plane, he simply went to his hotel near Lake Geneva, ordered a cup of mint tea, opened his laptop, and looked at the Aeroethics dashboard. All the status lines were green. System stable, audit ongoing. Martha Reynolds, who was on the same flight and sat across from him, asked softly, "Aren't you going to say anything? The world wants to hear you." Adrian looked out the window, where the city lights reflected on the water, then said slowly, "Martha, sometimes silence is a loud enough answer. They don't need to hear me. They need to hear their own conscience." Martha nodded. She understood. This man was more than just a CEO. He was a reminder that intelligence could triumph over power, and that morality never needed to be shouted at. In Zurich, Nina receives an internal message from Adrian. Let the system breathe. No statement. She just smiled and replied, "Understood. Dr. Cole." The next day, major newspapers published a photo of Adrian sitting in cabin 2A, the light reflecting off his calm face, with the headline, "The man did not need to speak, but the whole world listened." 3 weeks after the Orion collapse, Europe's aviation industry has yet to recover. But in Zurich, inside the glass-topped Aeroethics building, Dr. Adrian Cole isn't concerned about stock prices or buzz. He's doing what he always does, turning the crisis into a framework. The 21st floor conference room was ablaze with early morning sunlight. The large screen displayed the new logo, Cole Protocol, a clean, serious font, accompanied by the slogan, "Dignity as Infrastructure." Adrian stood by the table, holding a metal pen, his voice calm. "We can't wait for an airline to insult a passenger before we react. We need a real-time ethics system, not based on emotions, but on data." On the screen appears a dashboard. Airlines are scored based on service behavior, complaint rates, staff response, and even cabin language. Below 78% of the ethical score, the airline will lose its privileges to operate in the member's flight zone, Nina Volkov explained. Any serious violation will trigger an automatic investigation and a temporary suspension of the license. Adrian nodded. And any employees who violate the rules won't be fired immediately. They'll be retrained to understand that sometimes justice isn't about punishment. It's about making things right. Henry Saavedra chimed in, his voice full of excitement. "We have completed the behavioral feedback protocol. If the AI detects discriminatory language or gestures, the system will send a warning directly to the airline's ethics management center, with recommendations for retraining." Adrian gave a small, rare smile. "Good. Justice should not come from anger. It should come from process." The room was silent for a moment. Then Nina asked, "What will be the official name of this system?" "Sir Cole Protocol," he replied curtly, "not because I created it, but because I would be responsible if it failed." Outside, Zurich was raining lightly. The Limit River flowed quietly, reflecting the office lights. Adrian looked out through the glass, his gaze calm, of someone who had suffered prejudice, but who chose to make laws rather than take revenge. That evening, the news spread across airlines. Aeroethics launched Cole Protocol, the world's first real-time flight ethics rating system. BBC World News opens with the statement, "Below 78% ethics score, and you will have to stop taking off." Reporter comments, "This is not just a technical protocol, it is a social statement. The respect for human beings must be seen as mandatory infrastructure, not a personal choice." In New York, aviation experts were in heated debate. Some praised Adrian as the moral architect of modern aviation. Others worried that he was holding too much power in his hands. But Adrian didn't respond. He didn't need to. For him, the system spoke loudly enough. One evening, Martha Reynolds called him from Boston. "Adrian," she said warmly on the phone, "the whole world is talking about you, but you're silent." "Why?" He chuckled. "Because I want them to remember what I did, not what I said. And Cole Protocol, that's great. But why dignity as infrastructure?" Adrian mused. "Because I believe that dignity shouldn't be a promise. It should be part of the social fabric. Like the concrete on a runway. No one sees it, but it's what makes it possible to take off." Martha was silent for a few seconds, then said softly, "Do you know what? Adrian, maybe God sent you here not to retaliate, but to remind people how to do it again." He simply replied, "Maybe so." The following week, Aero Ethics received more than 24 applications from airlines to join the Cole Protocol. Among them was a letter from Aurelian Air. Frederick Vaughn wrote succinctly, "We would like to participate in the pilot program, not to restore our reputation, but to restore our culture." Adrian read the letter, then forwarded it to Nina with a note. "Approve, but monitor closely." The global press conference took place a week later in Zurich. Journalists crowded in, waiting to see what the man who had shut down 4 airports would say. Adrian took the podium, with no speech, just a few handwritten notes. "We can fix planes, we can patch engines, but we cannot fly safely if our morals are broken. Cole Protocol is not about punishment. It is about protecting a value we have forgotten, that every passenger, regardless of skin color, has the same value when they take off." He paused, looking straight into the camera. "And from today, respect is no longer an option. It is the rule." The room fell silent. For a brief moment, then applause broke out, slow but intense, like the roar of an engine starting a new era. Adrian returned to the office late that evening. He sat in front of his monitor and saw a series of blinking green dots, each one a participating airline in the Cole Protocol, learning to measure ethics like pressure. He closed his eyes and exhaled slowly. In that silence, the world began to turn again, not with fear this time, but with awareness. And in the distance, high above, an Aurelian-branded plane flies silently through Zurich airspace. 2 months later, the story of Cole Protocol is no longer just tech news. It has entered the political arena in Washington, D.C., before dozens of television cameras. Dr. Adrian Cole sits in the middle of the large room of the U.S. Senate Committee on Transport Ethics. The back row of seats was filled with a mix of interest groups, airline representatives, lawyers, ESG investors, and passengers who had been victims of discrimination. The television lights were white, but Adrian's voice was deep and clear, as if each word was carefully considered before leaving his lips. "Senator Elaine Harper, chair of the committee, began Dr. Cole. You created a system that changed the entire airline industry in 3 weeks. But many people say you're turning ethics into a tool of punishment. What do you say to that?" Adrian looked straight at her, calm as ever. "If weather can cause a flight to be delayed because of a safety risk, then discrimination should have the same power, because it also causes accidents, only accidents in the hearts of people." The room fell silent. The air was thick, as if someone had just taken a deep breath and not yet let it out. "I didn't create the Cole Protocol to punish anyone," he continued. "I just put a mirror in the sky. If anyone looks into it and sees a distorted image, They have to correct themselves. If they reflect respect, they have nothing to fear. A young senator asked, "So, you believe that morality can be measured by data?" Adrian replied, softly but firmly, "I believe that behavior can be measured, and when behavior is repeated, it becomes culture. I only measure culture." He stood up and walked towards the blackboard. 3 big words appeared on the screen: transparency, accountability, restoration. These 3 pillars, Adrian says, are the structure of justice in a closed environment like aviation. Transparency, so no one can say, "I didn't know." Accountability, so no one can say, "I was just following orders." And rehabilitation, so that those who have done wrong have a chance to do it again, rather than being eliminated. He paused, because true justice does not aim at destroying people, but at rebuilding them. A New York Times reporter whispered to a colleague, "He doesn't talk like a politician. He talks like someone who has been through a war and still believes in humanity." During the committee's discussion, a veteran congressman, Mr. William Pratt, who had vehemently opposed the Cole Protocol, spoke up. "Dr. Cole, I read the newspapers. I know you were once a humiliated passenger. Now you have the power to retaliate. But if that power falls into the hands of others, are you sure they will use it properly?" Adrian looked at him, his eyes non-confrontational. "I can't control people, Senator, but I can leave them frameworks that make it harder for them to do wrong. Laws can't make us better, but they can make it harder for us to become worse." William was silent. A man sitting next to him nodded. Adrian continued, his voice low and filled with emotion. "I have been on a flight where a bag was considered more valuable than a person. If that can happen in the air, the system on the ground needs to be reworked." The words echoed around the room. Reporters immediately wrote them down. The next day, it was the main headline on the front page of the Washington Post. If a bag is worth more than a person, the system needs to be reworked. After the hearing, a reporter asked him in the hallway, "Dr. Cole, do you think you are changing American politics?" He smiled faintly. "No, I'm just reminding them that morality should not have parties." Outside, it was raining lightly in D.C. Adrian, wearing a gray beanie, walked out of the Capitol building. His old friend, Martha Reynolds, was waiting with an umbrella. "You spoke at the right time," she said. "They may not all agree, but they have to listen." Adrian nodded. "I don't want them to agree. I just want them to start thinking." They walked down the stone steps. In the light rain, the American flag fluttered atop the building. Martha looked up and said softly, "Once upon a time, I thought justice was the sound of a judge's gavel. Today, I think it's your deep, calm voice." Adrian smiled. "No, Martha, justice is a silence when people understand they need to change." That evening, 60 Minutes rebroadcast the entire hearing. An elderly Atlanta viewer commented online, "He doesn't speak up to win. He speaks up to make us look at ourselves." And just as the world thought Adrian Cole was just a political engineer, he proved that justice doesn't require power, but structure. A structure that respects people, whether they sit in seat 2A or the last row. 3 months after the hearings in Washington, the aviation world began to change, not because it was forced to, but because it had no other choice. In the glass-walled offices of Aeroethics HQ in Zurich, Nina Volkov strode into the conference room, a thick file in hand. "Adrian, here's the new list. Today, 8 more airlines signed up for the Aeroethics pre-certification program. They want to get certified before the mandatory law comes into effect. Adrian glanced at them. The names made him smile a little. Emirates, Lufthansa, Singapore Airlines, the once proudest airlines now voluntarily participating. He said softly, "Good. When people actively seek standards, it means the market has chosen the right side." Henry Saavedra, who was making coffee, added, "We received feedback from 3 large ESG funds. They announced that from next quarter, they will only invest in companies that meet the coal protocol." Adrian asked, "Who is leading that alliance?" Henry replied, "BlackRock, Vanguard, and Norges Bank. They call it the Dignity Index." The room erupted in laughter. What was once considered a moral theory was now a financial indicator, and in a world where money dictates behavior, the commercialization of morality is a sign of evolution. The news spread quickly. The Financial Times wrote, "Aeroethics becomes the first standard to connect behavioral ethics and investment performance. Major funds declare respect is an asset." Adrian read the passage in silence. Then he said softly to Nina, "The market can be cruel, but it is also smart. It always bets on what is most durable." Nina asked, "And what do you think is the most lasting thing?" Adrian replied, "Self-respect. It can't be bought. It can only be kept." The next day, Adrian's inbox received an email bearing the Aurelian Air logo. Sender, Frederick Vaughn. The subject line was simple: request for discussion, path to restoration. He opened the letter. Frederick's tone was no longer as flowery as it had been in previous years, but frank and weary. "Dr. Cole, we admit that Aurelian has lost the most important thing, trust. I don't apologize, because I know it's not enough. But I want to ask, is there any way we can fix it?" Adrian finished reading, was silent for a moment, then replied, "No need to apologize. Just prove it." He sent it, then sat back in his chair. In the dim light of the Zurich afternoon, his face reflected on the screen, silent, but determined. A week later, a Wall Street Journal reporter interviewed Frederick Vaughn. He said, "I used to think ethics was something you wrote about in a report. But after Coal Protocol, I realized it's something passengers feel when they get on the plane. And if we want to survive, we have to live up to the expectations of the seats they sit in." Aurelian's transformation didn't come just from the crisis. They rehired hundreds of employees who had been unfairly fired in the past and launched a human before passenger training program. One of the first instructors they brought in was Martha Reynolds. When asked why she accepted, Martha simply said, "Because I want to see with my own eyes the day an airline learns to bow its head without feeling any lower." Meanwhile, in Boston, an ESG investment conference gathered thousands of people. On a large screen, the Coal Protocol logo was projected as part of a global sustainability standard. One speaker said, "We used to judge companies by their carbon. Now, we judge them by how they treat their people." Adrian quietly entered the auditorium. He did not speak, but listened. When his presentation ended, a young investor came up and shook his hand. "Dr. Cole," he said, "you have taught us that profit and ethics are not opposites. They are 2 sides of the same coin." Adrian just smiled. If we know how to pick the right coin. That evening, back in Zurich, he sat alone in his office, looking out at the snow-capped mountains in the distance. A new email popped up. Aurelian scored 84 ethics points. Provisional certification approved. He read, smiling slightly, "They did it." Nina stepped in and asked quietly, "Are you going to make it public?" "No," Adrian said. "They don't need praise. They need to keep doing the right thing, even when no one is looking." And then, like every night, he opened the window and took a deep breath of the cold air. Outside, an airplane flew across the night sky, its lights flashing, reflecting off the surface of Lake Zurich. Adrian watched, his heart at peace. The world still had people willing to change, and perhaps that was what made him believe that people, no matter how lost, could fly again if they learned to take off with respect. Elsewhere, more than 4,000 miles from Zurich, autumn had touched the maple forests of Vermont. In a small lecture hall at the University of Vermont, the woman who had silenced the entire cabin of Flight 214 Vanessa Hale sat in the third row, taking careful notes like a freshman. No more silk dresses or expensive handbags. She wears a gray sweater, her hair tied up, her face so simple that if you didn't pay attention, no one would realize that she was once the heiress of the Hale Foundation, the most prestigious investment fund in New York. A year ago, when the story of the 2A seat strap broke in the media, the foundation's board forced Vanessa to step down from all executive positions. The press called it the quiet collapse of the Hale family. But in truth, she heard it more clearly than anyone, not of her reputation, but of her ego. At first, Vanessa resisted. She thought the media was exaggerating, that she was the victim of a misunderstanding. But the more she tried to reason, the more her excuses rang hollow. And then, one day, looking back at the flight footage where Adrian Cole had simply said, "I'm leaving," she realized something she'd never understood. True power doesn't require speaking aloud. It was that moment that made her silent for a long time. The following spring, she applied to a graduate program in business ethics and social leadership at Vermont. No one in her family understood why. Some friends called it a reenactment to clear her name. But Vanessa no longer cared about those words. She knew she couldn't erase the past, but she could learn to see it more clearly. In class, Professor Miriam Clark, a woman in her 60s with a slow but sharp demeanor, once asked Vanessa during a discussion, "What do you think is a moral mistake Vanessa was silent for a long time?" Then she replied, "It's when we believe that our status exempts us from basic courtesy. And the worst part is, we don't realize who we've hurt, simply because they don't tell us." The whole class was silent. Miriam smiled slightly, but said nothing more. In December, when the final essay deadline came, Vanessa chose to write an essay titled "The Seat I Took That Wasn't Mine." She wrote without embellishment or self-justification. The essay began with a single sentence: "I sat in a chair that did not belong to me, and only when it was taken away did I learn to stand up properly." In the article, Vanessa recounts the moment she saw Adrian Cole's eyes calm, not hateful, not resentful, but enough to make her feel so small that she had to look back at herself. She described, "I used to think power meant being listened to, being given priority, being able to step up when I wanted. But he taught me that there is another kind of power, quieter, deeper, the power of someone who doesn't need to win to be respected. And I learned that truly strong people don't respond with anger, but with order." Her paper was chosen to be presented at the Ethics in the Age of Systems conference in Burlington. When she stood up to read, her voice was shaky, but her eyes were clear. In the audience that day, there was a man sitting in the back row, Adrian Cole. He came not as a speaker, but as a silent observer of a human journey to self-salvation. When Vanessa finished reading, she looked up and met Adrian's eyes. He said nothing, just nodded, but to her, the nod meant more than forgiveness. After the seminar, they met outside in the cold Vermont air. "Dr. Cole," she said, "I don't expect your forgiveness." He smiled. "I know, but you're doing something very few people have the courage to do, to relearn." Vanessa looked into the distance. "I used to think relearning meant turning back, but now I see. Sometimes it's just learning to slow down to see others." Adrian replied softly. "You saw it." They stood still in the snow. Neither said anything else, but in that silence, something closed. Not a chapter of grief, but a cycle of realization. A few months later, her essay, "The Seat I Took That Wasn't Mine," was republished in the Atlantic magazine and quickly went viral. Thousands of comments poured in, many of whom recognized themselves in her story, not in their privileged position, but in their accidental inability to see others. One of the most shared comments read, "She didn't lose her seat. She regained it." And in the years since, Vanessa Hale has been far from the girl in the 2A bag. She has become a visiting lecturer in organizational ethics at Vermont, who often begins her classes by saying, "Don't be afraid of losing your place. Sometimes that's the only way to know where you truly belong." In Zurich, when he read the article about her, Adrian just smiled. He wrote a short line in his notebook. "A system is truly valuable not when it punishes people for doing wrong, but when it helps them learn to do right." And somewhere, high in the sky, flights bearing the Aurelian Air and Aeroethics certified logos still quietly take off, as proof that justice, when fueled by kindness, can lift the world a little higher. It's a spring morning in Zurich. The sky is as clear as glass. In the conference room of Aeroethics HQ, Dr. Adrian Cole stands by the window, looking out at the mist-shrouded Alps. At his desk, his phone buzzes, constantly calls from Washington, Brussels, Tokyo. Everyone wants the same thing: to invite him to head a new agency, to hold a government post, to shape global ethics policy for the aviation industry. But Adrian just shook his head. He knew he was not born to be a politician. He was born to build structures, not to stand at the podium of power. Nina Volkov entered, placing before him an invitation from the International Joint Transport Commission, ITC. The last line in bold: "We would be honored if you would serve as Chief Global Ethics Commissioner." Adrian smiled, folded the letter, and set it aside. "We don't need more people giving orders," he said. "We need a system that can work without me." That statement was the starting point for the final breakthrough, the Aeroethics Open License. An open license for the entire world to use the aviation ethics assessment platform he had built for free. No more exclusive copyrights. No more licensing fees. The only condition: all data must be public so anyone can verify it. "Adrian, you're leaving out billions of dollars in profits." Henry Saavedra countered. "Henry, profits don't change the world. Standards do." He laughed. The news spread quickly. CNN reported Coal Decline's government role opens ethics framework to the world. Within a month, 47 international airports had signed on to the new system. By the third month, New York JFK, Tokyo Haneda, Oslo Gardermoen, and Vienna International had all announced they had signed the Passenger Equity Accord. At the ceremony in New York, when signing the document, JFK Airport Director said, "From today, we can no longer promise to apologize to passengers if something goes wrong. Instead, We can guarantee that it won't happen, because our standards can now be verified." At the back of the hall, Adrian sat silently. He did not step up to the podium, did not speak. He just watched the signatures run down, one after another. This was what he had hoped. Morality was no longer a promise, but a process. Martha Reynolds, an old friend, accompanied him to the signing. As they walked out, she asked, "Don't you feel sorry, Adrian? You could have been the most powerful person in the business." He smiled. "I've seen power, and I know that real power is when you can walk away and everything will still work out." On his way back to Zurich, he received a text message from Vanessa Hale. "I just finished my first semester. Here, they teach that morality is collective. I think you understood that long ago." He replied, "No one is born knowing. We just need to be humble enough to learn." As the plane landed in Zurich, the afternoon light streamed through the window, reflecting on his face. A quiet moment, as if the sky were smiling. The next day, the Aeroethics Open license was officially announced. The announcement contained only 2 lines. No more apologies, only verifiable standards. During the press conference, a reporter asked Dr. Cole, "Aren't you afraid that others will take advantage of your work?" Adrian replied gently, "No. If someone copies it to do something better, they are helping me achieve my goal sooner." At that moment, the room fell silent. There was no applause, just a ripple of respect. 3 months later, a large wall was erected at the exit of Zurich Airport, engraved with words in 32 languages. In the center, engraved were his exact words, "Dignity is not a slogan. It is an infrastructure." Foreign tourists passing by stopped to take photos. A group of students from Tokyo placed their hands on the sign and whispered, "This is justice without a court." As Adrian passed by, he stopped, just looked, and did not sign his name. He wanted people to remember the idea, not the person who created it. In the evening, in his office, he opened the Aeroethics system map again, now spanning 5 continents. The points of light appeared like constellations, connected by thin lines. Adrian said to himself quietly, "No one can keep justice. I can only open it." And outside the window, it began to snow. White flakes blanketed the city of Zurich, where a man who had once been denied a chair now set up a table for the world. On a late winter morning, the sky over Zurich was a clean blue, as if washed clean. Dr. Adrian Cole, dragging his small suitcase, walked through the departure hall of the international airport where he had once been asked to wait outside. 12 years had passed. But the image of that gate remained etched in his memory not as a wound, but as the beginning of something larger than himself. This time, everything was different. Right above the entrance to the premier boarding area, a new sign was erected, a pristine white background, the words engraved in shining silver steel. "All travelers deserve dignity before we know their name." Not a slogan, not an advertising campaign. It's a commitment, the first globally applicable standard under the Passenger Equity Accord, an agreement that Adrian himself spearheaded. He stood silently staring at the words. The sounds around him, the loudspeaker calling flights, the sound of shoes scuffing on the stone floor, the laughter of a young couple blended into the simple soundtrack of life. A young, trim airport employee approached. He smiled. "Welcome aboard, Dr. Cole." Adrian was a little surprised. He wasn't used to being recognized in places like this. "Thanks," he said simply. The clerk continued, "I studied aviation ethics in Vienna. We had a class on you and on the Cole Protocol. The teacher said that, without you, the department might still think sorry was enough." Adrian chuckled lightly, his eyes warm. "In that case, make sure you don't apologize to anyone." The clerk nodded, a little moved. As he stepped through the gate, the automatic lights illuminated his face, reflecting off the glass of the airport, a place where people had often seen arrogance, indifference, and invisible boundaries. But now, that light was only peaceful. Adrian entered the cabin. Seat 2A, the fateful seat from years ago, was still there. But today, he did not sit there. He chose the middle row, near the window. When the flight attendant asked why, he smiled. "Sometimes you can see the sky best when you're not sitting in the best seat." As the plane took off, Zurich shrank below, like an endless web of light. In the cabin, passengers spoke softly. No one raised their voices. No one was ignored. In the distance, a little girl offered her seat to an elderly person. A flight attendant bowed in gratitude with sincere eyes. Adrian looked at the scene, and in his head echoed the voice of Martha Reynolds, his old friend, now deceased. "You can't change the way the world sees you, Adrian, but you can change the way the world sees itself." He nodded slightly, as if answering her. The flight was headed to New York, where the 10th anniversary of the Passenger Equity Accord was being celebrated. There, his name would be inscribed on the honor roll alongside hundreds of others, people who believe that dignity is not a privilege, but a natural right. As the plane broke through the clouds, the flight attendant, Elise Carter, now Aurelian Air's director of training, passed by. Recognizing Adrian, she smiled. "We meet again, Dr. Cole." He looked up, his smile gentle. "No one needs to give up their seat this time, right?" Elise nodded. "No one has to. All seats are 2A. They laughed together for a brief but strangely full moment. When the plane landed at JFK, passengers lined up to leave the plane in an orderly manner, without any jostling. Right at the exit, a large screen displayed the following text: "Verified by Aeroethics, Passenger Equity Level Platinum." Adrian stepped out of the gate, the morning light illuminating his face. A group of reporters tried to approach, but he raised his hand. Politely declining, he did not want to speak. There was no need to say anything more, because it's all there, in the way people look at each other with respect, in the peace in the airport hallways, in every welcome aboard said without thinking. He paused, looking through the wide windows of the terminal. An Aurelian Air was preparing to take off. The Aeroethics certified logo reflected the sunlight. In that moment, he realized true justice does not need symbols, because its very existence is a symbol. And if someone asked him where it all began, he would probably just smile from an empty chair and a seemingly small rejection. But the end result, not an apology, but a world where people are treated fairly, before anyone knows who they are. They refused a seat, but he built the runway. The story of Dr. Adrian Cole, a black man denied a seat on a flight, is not just a social tragedy, but a mirror for the modern world that intelligence, dignity, and composure can change the system. Adrian did not choose anger. He chose to act quietly, letting the system prove itself. It was his calm that created a ripple effect that led 4 airports to stop working with the discriminatory airline, ushering in a new global standard of ethics and fairness, where dignity becomes infrastructure. The message reaches each of us sometimes. Justice doesn't need shouting. It just needs standing firm in the truth. When we face prejudice, instead of responding with anger, let our values speak for themselves. True justice is not about winning others over, but about making them look at themselves and change. If you believe that everyone deserves respect before they know who they are, then this story is for you. Like, share this video, and subscribe to our channel to help us spread the stories of silent justice where kindness is not loud, but can make the world stop and listen. Thank you for joining us. You're not just watching a video, you're empowering a way of life,